At 8 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in the middle of Manhattan, a skyscraper began to fold. Not fall, fold. On the 21st floor of the former Pfizer World Headquarters on East 42nd Street, construction workers watched two massive steel columns, members designed to carry thousands of tons, bend like drinking straws. The steel didn't crack, it didn't snap, it buckled, bowing outward in slow motion while the floors above began to sag. Within the hour, police and firefighters were emptying an entire section of Midtown, 1 block from the Chrysler Building, because this was no ordinary construction site. This tower is the flagship of the biggest bet in American real estate, a nearly $750 million gamble that the country's empty office towers can become the homes its cities desperately need. So how does a fully permitted, fully engineered flagship project, the biggest office-to-apartment conversion in American history, come within inches of collapse? The answer was hiding in plain sight. The first sign of trouble was almost mundane. Just before 8 a.m. on July 7, 2026, the New York City Fire Department received a call reporting bricks falling from a high-rise at 235 East 42nd Street, between 2nd and 3rd Avenues. Falling debris in Manhattan is serious, but it's not unheard of. What the first responders found when they arrived was something else entirely.
We're getting reports from the construction that 2 columns buckled on the 21st floor.
The workers on that floor had seen the columns starting to give way, and they had the video to prove it. Footage taken by frightened workers inside the building shows an entire floor of badly bent steel. Structural columns bowed visibly out of line. Interior metal wall studs bent and crumpled as the floors above pressed down on them. According to the fire department, the damage extended across floors 21 through 26, multiple cracks, sagging floors, and 2 load-bearing structural columns that had buckled. One structural engineer who reviewed the footage put it bluntly on CNN, the flange at the bottom of one column had torn completely. That column was no longer serving its structural function, which, in engineering terms, is the definition of failure. The response was massive. The construction site was evacuated, hundreds of workers, all accounted for, no injuries. Then they went further. At least 9 neighboring buildings were emptied, including residential towers, a television news bureau forced to broadcast from the street, and a school on East 43rd where roughly 400 children were rushed out of their classrooms. The city declared a frozen zone from roughly 40th to 45th Streets, sealing off the heart of Midtown between Grand Central Terminal and the United Nations. New York's Mayor Zohan Mandami stood in front of the cameras as they called it an extremely serious situation. And the fire chief, John Esposito, delivered the line that kept everyone's attention locked on this tower. The building, he said,
evacuations of surrounding buildings, and the building has continued to move since we've been on the scene.
To understand why this happened, you need to understand what this building was and what it was being turned into. The tower is 235 East 42nd Street, built in the early 1960s for Pfizer, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. Next door, connected to it, sits 219 East 42nd, a building that dates all the way back to 1905. For decades, the complex was a fortress of corporate America, steel-framed office towers in a neighborhood built for commuters, briefcases, and 9-to-5 crowds. Then, the world changed. Remote work hollowed out office districts, leaving cities with millions of square feet of empty towers at the exact moment they faced a crushing housing shortage. The solution seemed obvious: convert the offices into apartments. And that's exactly what began here. The plan, designed by the architecture firm Gensler, was staggering. Roughly 1.3 million square feet of residential space and more than 1,600 apartments, around 400 of them affordable housing. On the shorter building at 219, developers were stacking 19 new stories on top of the century-old 10-floor structure. The taller tower at 235 was being vertically expanded as well, its new upper floors already topped out. The money matched the ambition. Investor David Werner paid $407 million just for the leasehold under the main tower, and in May of last year, the developers, Metro Loft, led by veteran conversion specialist Nathan Berman, alongside David Werner Real Estate Investments, closed a $720 million construction loan, the largest ever recorded for an office-to-residential conversion in New York, with the city adding a planned $467 million tax exemption in exchange for the affordable units. Completion was targeted for 2027. This wasn't just a construction project. It was the flagship for an entire strategy, proof that America's empty office towers could become the housing its cities desperately need. But office-to-residential conversions are notoriously complex. You're not building on a clean site. You're performing surgery on a 60-year-old patient, cutting new openings through floors for plumbing and ventilation, carving light wells into deep floor plates, and, in this case, stacking entirely new floors of steel and concrete on top of structures designed generations ago for a very different job. And on the morning of July 7th, somewhere in that equation, the numbers stopped adding up. A steel column fails in a very particular way. It doesn't usually shatter or snap. When a column is asked to carry more load than it can handle, it buckles. It bows out sideways, suddenly, and once that bending starts, the column's capacity collapses almost instantly. Engineers design against this with enormous margins. As one professor of structural engineering at the City College of New York explained on CBS, columns typically carry a factor of safety of around 3, meaning the loads had to blow through that entire margin before these members gave way. So why didn't the tower come down? The answer is redundancy, and it's the quiet hero of this entire story. A steel-framed building is not a house of cards. Its columns, beams and floors are all connected, and when one member fails, the load it was carrying doesn't just vanish. It redistributes, traveling through the frame to neighboring columns. That's exactly what happened here. When those two columns buckled, the floors above sagged, reportedly by as much as 4 inches, according to measurements the developer says his team recorded. But the surrounding structure picked up the load and held. That redundancy is also why the fire department's greatest fear was never the Hollywood scenario of a tower toppling onto the street. Officials were explicit. Because of the steel frame construction, the risk was a localized collapse, floors pancaking within one section of the building. Still catastrophic for anyone nearby, but it also meant that if the movement stopped, the building could be saved. So the city waited and watched. Engineers monitored the tower remotely from adjacent buildings, tracking every fraction of an inch of movement. By midday, the readings flattened. Only then could a team of 6 inspectors enter, riding an elevator to the 17th floor and climbing the rest of the way to look 2 buckled columns in the eye. Crews began installing temporary shoring, heavy steel posts and jacks to take the load off the damaged columns, with a third-party engineering firm brought in for an independent set of eyes. Within days, streets began to reopen. New York had gotten lucky, but luck is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Because here's where this story stops being a freak accident and starts looking like a pattern. This building did not have a clean record. The warning started on May 13, 2025, when 2 workers claimed they were struck by a falling object, an incident that produced 2 lawsuits in Manhattan Supreme Court. Over the following year, city records show a steady drumbeat of trouble, a suspected fire, complaints of unlicensed welders, sparks raining down on workers without safety blankets, concrete falling constantly from above, a large item that plunged through 5 floors and nearly hit someone. In September 2025, a worker named Wilmer Cabrera Roja was seriously injured when the wood he was standing on gave way. Another says he fell from a ladder this past March. The general contractor, 235 GC LLC, was hit with 7 violations and more than $32,000 in penalties in the year before the buckling, and all but one of those infractions was classified by the city as immediately hazardous. And here's the detail that should make everyone uncomfortable. Records show no money was actually paid on any of last year's violations. The paperwork was corrected, the certificates were accepted, and the project rolled on. One violation in December was for failing to even notify the city about a construction incident that resulted in injury. Then, days after the buckling, the New York Times uncovered something else. The private firm hired to perform the special inspections on this project, the company that certified the safety of the high-strength bolting, the steel welding, and the structural stability of the alterations, had itself been cited in the past for missing dangerous conditions at other Manhattan projects, including a complaint alleging it failed to report a collapsed facade. Whether that firm's work played any role here hasn't been established, but it raises the question every New Yorker should be asking. In a system where the city outsources verification to private inspectors, who is checking the checkers? Because the official system saw none of this coming. The Department of Buildings says this project went through an extensive, exhaustive 2-year plan review. The agency's own inspections in 2026 found no unsafe or non-code compliant conditions. On paper, 6 months before 2 columns folded, this site was clean. And the developer? Nathan Berman told the New York Times the incident was, quote, nothing more than a typical construction mishap. He told the Wall Street Journal the buckling was likely caused by added weight and insisted there was never any risk of collapse. By Wednesday, his company claimed the damage affected fewer than 30 of the project's apartments, promised to fully rebuild the damaged portion, and declared the project still on schedule, even as its own plan reportedly calls for replacing the facade, the floor plates, and the steel reinforcements across all 11 of the newly added floors. And drone footage released by the fire department revealed one more troubling detail. Where the fireproofing had fallen away from the buckled column, the steel underneath appeared heavily corroded, raising the possibility that these 2 columns may not be the whole problem, just the first ones to speak up. If you want to know what New York narrowly avoided, look at New Orleans. In October 2019, the upper floors of the Hard Rock Hotel, a building under construction just like this one, collapsed without enough warning. 3 workers were killed. In 1987, the L'Ambiance Plaza project in Bridgeport, Connecticut, came down mid-construction and killed 28. And in San Francisco in 2018, the brand new Salesforce Transit Center was shut down when workers discovered cracked steel girders, the closest parallel to what happened here, a structure that told on itself just in time. New York has been here before, and if you've watched our video on the John Hancock Tower and CityCop Center, you already know how these stories can end. In 1978, engineers realized the CityCop Tower could be toppled by the right storm and quietly welded it back to safety over 3 months of secret nighttime work, a fix the public wouldn't learn about for nearly 20 years. We told that whole story and its Boston twin in a video. Check it out after. But here's the difference. Those cover-ups stayed buried because nothing failed in public. This time, the steel bent in broad daylight on drone cameras in front of the entire world. There was nothing to hide. The former Pfizer headquarters will almost certainly be saved. The shoring is in, steel columns and posts installed from the 18th floor down to the 9th. The loads have been redirected and the rebuild will proceed. The cost and the delay will very likely be far larger than the developers' estimates. But the bigger question hangs over every skyline in America. Office to residential conversions is the strategy cities are betting on to solve 2 crises at once: empty towers and scarce housing. In Manhattan and Brooklyn alone, more than 17,000 apartments were announced in conversion projects between 2020 and early 2025. And the second largest conversion in the city, at 111 Wall Street, has already racked up 10 construction safety violations since the start of last year, more than this building had. New York's mayor said it himself.
Because this is not a necessary consequence of an office to residential conversion. This, however, is clearly a breakdown in that process.
The conversions will continue. They have to. The question is whether the process that missed this one gets fixed before the next building starts to bend. Because this building gave a warning. The next one might not. Now, when it's finished, this tower will hold 16,000 apartments. So here's the real question. Knowing what you just watched, would you sign a lease on the 21st floor? Or should a building that bent once never carry families at all? Tell me in the comments. And if you enjoyed this dive, subscribe for more Megabuild stories. See you in the next one.